Don't touch him. Someone could get sued. The voice rang sharp and cold across the dining room, just as Ethan Cole's body gave way and hit the polished marble floor with a dull, echoing thud that seemed louder than the clinking glasses and muted jazz combined. And for a split second, time fractured, forks paused midair, conversations died mid-sentence, and every eye turned not with urgency, but with hesitation. As if the man collapsing in a $2,000 suit was not a human being in distress, but a problem no one wanted to claim, because Ethan Cole wasn't just anyone. He was the CEO of Cole Dynamics, a man whose name carried weight from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, a man who had spent the last decade building an empire measured in billions in influence. And just minutes ago, he had been standing tall at the center of the private dining room, dismissing a junior staff member with a flick of his hand and a tone that made people shrink. A man used to control, used to command, used to being the one everyone moved for, but now he lay on the ground, pale, breath uneven, his hand twitching once before going still, and the room, filled with executives, investors, and perfectly dressed strangers, did something unexpected. It froze, not out of shock alone, but out of calculation, because helping meant involvement, and involvement meant risk, and risk was something people like them had spent their entire lives avoiding. So instead of stepping forward, they stepped back, subtle at first, a shift of a chair, a glance toward the exit. Someone whispering, "Call someone," but no one actually dialing, no one kneeling, no one breaking the invisible line between comfort and responsibility. And in the corner of the room, unnoticed as always, stood Maya Johnson, her tray balanced in one hand, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that didn't belong to someone in a moment like this, because 5 minutes earlier, she had been just another server, another uniform, another face that blurred into the background of luxury, called sweetheart without eye contact, thanked without meaning, dismissed without thought. But now her eyes were locked on Ethan, not on his watch, not on his title, not on the whispers swirling around him, but on the rise and fall of his chest, the rhythm that didn't look right, the silence between breaths that stretched just a little too long. And something in her shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet tightening in her chest, a memory brushing against the present like a shadow she couldn't ignore, because she had seen this before, not in a room like this, not under chandeliers and million-dollar deals, but in a place that smelled like antiseptic and fear, where waiting had cost something she could never get back. And for a moment, she didn't move, not because she didn't know what to do, but because she understood exactly what stepping forward would mean: rules broken, lines crossed, consequences that didn't care about intentions. And across the room, someone laughed nervously, a brittle sound that cracked the tension instead of easing it. "Where's the manager?" Another voice muttered, louder now, as if saying it made it someone else's responsibility, and Maya's grip on the tray tightened just enough for the glasses to clink softly, a fragile, almost musical reminder that everything in this room was designed to look perfect, even as something very real was slipping out of control right in front of them. And then she saw it, the subtle shift in Ethan's breathing, the kind most people would miss, the kind you only notice if you've been trained to look. And in that instant, the room faded, the noise dulled, the hesitation of everyone else became irrelevant. Because to her, he wasn't a billionaire, he wasn't a headline, he wasn't the man who could buy the entire building without blinking. He was just a person running out of time. And the question wasn't whether she should act, it was whether she could live with herself if she didn't. And somewhere deep inside, past the fear, past the rules, past the weight of being the one no one expected to matter, the answer came quietly but firmly, and her foot moved before anyone else even realized she had made a decision. The tray hit the table behind her with a soft but decisive clatter, the kind that made a few heads snap in her direction, not because it was loud, but because it was out of place. And in a room where everything followed an invisible script, even the smallest deviation felt like a disruption. And Maya did not slow down, did not look for permission, did not wait for a manager to nod or a guest to approve. She moved straight toward Ethan, her steps steady, her eyes focused, cutting through the circle of hesitation that had formed around him like an invisible barrier. And as she dropped to her knees beside him, a voice came sharp and immediate from somewhere behind her. "Hey, you cannot just do that." But it sounded distant, muffled, like noise from another room, because Maya was already counting, already watching, already listening to something deeper than the panic in the air. She placed her fingers near his neck, not rushed, not trembling, just precise, measuring, waiting, and the silence that followed stretched tighter than before, because now someone had broken the stillness, and it was not one of the executives, not one of the men in tailored suits who had been discussing multi-million-dollar deals minutes earlier. It was her, the one they barely saw, the one who had been refilling their glasses without a second glance, and that alone shifted something in the room. Even if no one said it out loud, "He needs space," she said, her voice calm but firm, not loud, not dramatic, just certain in a way that did not invite debate. And for a second, no one moved, as if they were waiting to see who would override her, who would remind her of her place. But no one did, because certainty has a way of sounding like authority, and authority, even when unexpected, tends to be obeyed. And slowly, awkwardly, the circle widened, chairs scraped against the floor, heels stepped back. A man lowered his phone without realizing it, and Maya leaned closer, watching Ethan's chest, the uneven rise, the pause that lingered just a little too long, the kind of pause that made something inside her tighten. And again, that memory brushed against her, not fully formed, just enough to sharpen her focus. "Sir, can you hear me?" she said, not expecting an answer, but needing the rhythm of her own voice to anchor the moment. And somewhere behind her, the same nervous laughter from before tried to return, weaker now, uncertain. "Is someone calling emergency services?" she asked without looking up. And this time, the question landed differently, because it was no longer a suggestion floating in the air, it was a direction, and a man in a navy suit fumbled with his phone, nodding quickly as if he had been planning to do it all along. Yes, I am calling," he said, his voice slightly too loud, slightly too eager, and Maya nodded. Once, barely, her attention never leaving Ethan, and then she saw it, clearer now, the pattern she could not ignore, the kind of breathing that told a story if you knew how to read it. And without hesitation, she adjusted her position, her hands steady, her movements controlled, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, as if she had done this before, as if this moment, as unexpected as it was, fit into a part of her life the room could not see. And another voice cut in, sharper this time, closer, the manager, his tone tight with concern and something else, something like fear of liability. "Maya, step back. We have protocols for this," he said. But even he did not sound fully convinced, because protocols were only useful when someone actually followed them. And right now, no one else was stepping forward, no one else was taking control, and Maya did not look up, did not argue, did not explain. She simply continued, her focus unbroken, her voice steady as she spoke again. "He does not have time for protocol." And that sentence, simple and direct, cut through the room more effectively than any raised voice could have, because it named the truth everyone else was avoiding. And for the first time since Ethan had fallen, the room shifted not with hesitation, but with attention, all of it drawn to the woman they had not truly seen until this exact moment. The room did not breathe, it watched, and that shift was subtle but undeniable as every pair of eyes locked onto Maya, not as a server anymore, not as background, but as the only person moving with purpose, and she could feel it without looking up, the weight of attention, the quiet disbelief, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who does she think she is? But Maya did not answer that question with words. She answered it with precision, her hands placed exactly where they needed to be, her posture aligned, her focus absolute, as if the noise around her had been turned down to a distant hum. And for a moment, the world narrowed to a single point, the space between one breath and the next, the fragile rhythm she was trying to restore. And then she spoke again, not loudly, but clearly enough to cut through the tension. "Stay back, give him air." And this time, there was no hesitation. People moved immediately, not because they were told to, but because something in her tone made it feel necessary, urgent, real. And the manager who had stepped forward just seconds earlier stopped mid-step, his authority colliding with something stronger, something he could not quite name but instinctively recognized, competence. And across the room, the man on the phone nodded quickly, his voice rushed as he relayed details to emergency services, glancing at Maya as if waiting for cues, and she gave them without looking. "Tell them he is unresponsive and breathing irregularly," she said, her voice steady, and the man repeated her words almost exactly, his earlier confidence replaced with reliance. And in that moment, something shifted again, not just in the room, but in the invisible hierarchy that had defined it minutes ago. Because now the one giving direction was not the one in the expensive suit, not the one with the title, but the woman kneeling on the floor, her uniform simple, her presence undeniable, and as Maya continued, her movements measured, her breathing controlled, a flicker of memory sharpened into something clearer, a hospital hallway, the cold hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of someone saying wait, just wait, and how waiting had stretched into something irreversible, and she pushed that thought aside, not because it did not matter, but because it mattered too much. Because this moment was not about what had been lost, it was about what could still be saved, and she leaned closer, her focus tightening, reading the subtle signs, adjusting without hesitation her actions, guided by knowledge that had not faded even if her path had changed, and someone in the crowd whispered, "Is she trained?" The question barely audible but heavy with realization, and no one answered, because the answer was unfolding right in front of them, in the steadiness of her hands, in the certainty of her voice, in the way she did not second-guess, did not look around for approval. And then, just as the tension reached a point where it felt like it might snap, there was a change, small at first, almost imperceptible, but to Maya, it was everything, a shift in rhythm, a response where there had been none, and she paused for the briefest second, not out of doubt, but to confirm what she was feeling, and when she continued, there was a quiet intensity in her movements, a focus that deepened rather than eased, because progress did not mean safety, not yet, not until it held, and the room, once frozen in hesitation, now leaned in collectively, as if drawn by the gravity of the moment, as if understanding, finally, that what was happening was not just an interruption to their evening, but something far more human, something that did not care about status or wealth or who owned what. And in that silence, broken only by the distant sound of sirens growing closer, a realization settled over the crowd, not spoken, not acknowledged, but felt, that the person they had overlooked, the one they had barely seen, was the reason this moment had not already ended differently, and for the first time since he had fallen, Ethan Cole was no longer alone on that floor, not because of his power, not because of his name, but because someone had chosen to see him when no one else would. The first sound that truly broke the silence was not a voice but a breath, uneven but undeniable, and Maya felt it before anyone else recognized it. A faint return where there had been nothing steady before, and her shoulders lowered just slightly, not in relief but in recalibration, because this was not the end, not yet. This was the fragile middle where everything could still slip away if attention faltered, and she leaned in again, her voice softer now but still grounded. "Stay with me, sir," she said, not expecting recognition, but anchoring the moment in something human, something present, and for the first time, Ethan's fingers moved with intention, a slight twitch that rippled through the tension in the room like a quiet signal, and someone gasped, not loudly, but enough to shift the atmosphere from frozen fear to cautious hope, and suddenly the same people who had stepped back were leaning forward again, drawn not by curiosity this time, but by something closer to relief, as if witnessing a reversal they had not believed possible just moments earlier. And the manager, who had been hovering uncertainly at the edge, took a hesitant step closer, his voice lower now, stripped of authority. Is he coming back?" he asked, and Maya did not look up, did not rush to reassure. She simply continued, her focus unwavering, because she understood something the room did not. That moments like this were not about declarations, they were about consistency, about maintaining what had been regained, about not losing ground after fighting to get it back. And across the room, the sound of sirens grew louder, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but real and approaching, and it changed the energy again, adding urgency without panic, because now help was not just an idea, it was on its way. And yet, even with that, no one moved to replace her, no one stepped in to take over, because the truth had settled in too deeply. She was already the one in control, and interrupting that would feel like undoing something fragile. And Maya adjusted slightly, her movements precise, her attention shifting between the rhythm she was monitoring and the environment around her, ensuring space remained clear, ensuring nothing disrupted the narrow path back to stability. And then, without warning, Ethan's chest rose more fully, a deeper breath, uneven but stronger, and his head turned slightly to the side, not fully conscious, not fully aware, but no longer as distant as he had been. And that was the moment the room truly exhaled, a collective release that had been held back for too long. And someone whispered, "He is breathing," as if saying it too loudly might break it. And Maya allowed herself a single glance upward, not at the crowd, not at the manager, but at the man in front of her, confirming what she already knew, that he was coming back, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. And in that brief glance, something shifted again, not in her actions, but in the way she was seen, because now she was not just the one who stepped forward, she was the reason the outcome had changed. And that realization moved through the room quietly but powerfully, reshaping every earlier moment, every ignored glance, every dismissive tone, every assumption that had been made about who mattered and who did not. And as the sirens finally reached the entrance, their sound echoing through the polished space, Maya leaned back just slightly, not withdrawing, but making room for what was coming next, her job not finished, but transitioning. And for the first time since she had stepped forward, she allowed herself a breath, controlled, steady, not of relief, but of recognition, that the line between loss and recovery had been crossed, not by chance, not by status, but by a choice, a simple, decisive choice to act when no one else would. And in that moment, before the doors opened and the professionals rushed in, before questions were asked and roles were reassigned, there was a quiet, unspoken truth hanging in the air, that everything about this night had already changed. And it had changed because the one person no one expected to matter refused to stand still. The doors burst open with controlled urgency, not chaos, as two paramedics stepped in with practiced focus, their presence cutting cleanly through the tension that still lingered in the air. And for the first time since everything began, authority shifted again, but this time it did not erase what had already been established, it built on it. Because as they approached, one of them looked directly at Maya and asked, "What do we have?" Not dismissing her, not overlooking her, but recognizing her as the one who knew. And Maya responded without hesitation, her voice steady, precise, loss of responsiveness, irregular breathing, regained partial rhythm about 30 seconds ago. And the paramedic nodded, immediately, absorbing every word, not questioning, not correcting, just continuing the chain of action she had started. And as they moved into position, carefully assessing, preparing, transitioning control with seamless efficiency, Maya shifted back just enough to give them space, her hands lowering but her attention still locked in, as if letting go physically did not mean disengaging mentally. And around them, the room remained silent, not frozen anymore, but changed, as if everyone understood that speaking too loudly would break something that had just been carefully put back together. And Ethan's eyes fluttered slightly, not fully open, not focused, but present in a way they had not been before. And one of the paramedics spoke calmly, guiding him, grounding him, while the other prepared equipment with quiet precision. And Maya watched for a second longer, confirming what she needed to confirm, that he was no longer slipping, that the trajectory had shifted in the right direction. And only then did she begin to stand, slowly, not drawing attention, not seeking acknowledgement, just returning to a place that felt familiar even if nothing else did. And as she rose, her legs felt heavier than before, not from exhaustion alone, but from the weight of everything that had just passed. And she stepped back, blending toward the edge of the room again, the place where she had started, the place where she was expected to remain. And yet it was no longer the same, because now every glance that fell on her carried something different, not dismissal, not indifference, but recognition, quiet, sometimes uncomfortable recognition. And the manager, who had earlier tried to stop her, approached slowly, his expression uncertain, searching for the right words. And when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the edge it had carried before. "Maya, I did not know," he began, but the sentence trailed off, unfinished, because there was no simple way to complete it, no easy phrase that could bridge the gap between what he had assumed and what he had just witnessed. And Maya met his gaze briefly, her expression calm, not confrontational, not triumphant, just steady, and she gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement, as if to say that what mattered had already happened, and words were no longer necessary. And behind them, the paramedics carefully prepared to move Ethan, coordinating with quiet efficiency, their voices low, their movements deliberate. And as they lifted him onto the stretcher, the room shifted again, people stepping aside more quickly this time, more willingly, as if understanding now that presence meant participation, that distance was no longer an option. And as Ethan was guided toward the exit, his head turned slightly, his eyes opening just enough to catch fragments of the room, shapes, light, movement, and for a brief second, they landed on Maya, not with clarity, not with full awareness, but enough to register something, someone. And though he could not yet form the thought, could not yet understand the moment, there was a flicker there, a connection forming in the quiet space between confusion and realization. And then he was gone, carried out through the same doors that had brought help in, leaving behind a room that no longer felt the same, a room that had witnessed something it could not unsee. And at the edge of it all, Maya stood still for just a moment, her hands now empty, her breathing steady, her presence once again quiet, but no longer invisible, because even as the noise slowly returned, as conversations resumed in hushed tones, as the world tried to reset itself, there was one truth that lingered beneath it all, unspoken but undeniable, that the line between being overlooked and being essential had just been crossed, and everyone in that room had seen exactly how it happened. The sound of the doors closing behind the paramedics did not restore the room to what it had been. It only revealed how much had changed, because the music that had once filled the space now felt distant, almost out of place, and the conversations that slowly tried to return came back quieter, fragmented, as if everyone was speaking through a layer of thought they had not expected to confront tonight. And Maya did not move immediately. She remained where she was for a few seconds longer than necessary, her gaze fixed on the empty space where Ethan had been, not out of attachment, but out of habit, the kind that forms when your mind is still running through possibilities, checking outcomes, making sure nothing was missed. And only when she was certain that there was nothing more she could do did she finally exhale fully, a controlled release that marked the end of something intense and the beginning of something quieter. And then she turned, not dramatically, not seeking acknowledgement, but simply returning to the rhythm she knew, the one that had defined her role long before this moment interrupted it. And as she reached for a fresh tray, her hands moved with the same precision as before, but there was a subtle difference now, not in skill, but in awareness, because the room was no longer ignoring her. Every movement she made carried weight, every step was noticed, and even the smallest action seemed to draw attention that had not existed before. And at table 7, a man who had earlier avoided eye contact now looked directly at her, his expression uncertain, as if trying to reconcile the person he thought he saw with the one he had just witnessed. And when she placed a glass in front of him, he hesitated for a second before saying, "Thank you," not out of politeness, but with intention. And Maya gave a small nod, not lingering, not engaging, just acknowledging and moving on, because for her, this was not about changing how she was treated, it was about doing what needed to be done when it mattered. And behind the bar, 2 staff members whispered quietly, their voices low but not low enough to escape notice. "Did you know she could do that?" one asked, and the other shook their head. "No, I thought she was just..." The sentence trailed off, unfinished, because whatever they had assumed no longer fit, and that incomplete thought lingered in the air like a realization still forming. And the manager stood near the entrance for a moment longer than necessary, watching the room, watching Maya, his expression caught between relief and something closer to reflection, because leadership, he realized too late, was not always where he expected it to be. And across the room, a woman quietly placed her phone down, the screen still glowing from a video she had started recording but never finished, and she looked at it for a second before turning it off completely, as if deciding that what had happened was not something to be replayed. but something to be understood, and as the minutes passed, the room continued its slow attempt to return to normal. Plates were adjusted, drinks were refilled, conversations resumed in careful tones, but beneath it all, there was a shift that could not be undone, a quiet awareness that had settled into every corner of the space, and Maya moved through it all with the same steady presence she had always carried, not altered by attention, not defined by recognition, just grounded in something deeper, something that did not depend on who was watching. And yet, even as she blended back into the rhythm of service, there was one difference she could not ignore. The way people looked at her now, not as background, not as invisible, but as someone who had stepped into a moment that others had stepped away from. And in that contrast, something larger than the night itself began to take shape, something that would not end when the last table cleared or the lights dimmed, because sometimes the most powerful change does not come from what is said, but from what is seen, and once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. Later that night, long after the emergency lights outside had faded and the restaurant had returned to its controlled elegance, the atmosphere inside felt different in a way no amount of cleaning or rearranging could fix, because something had entered the space and stayed there, invisible but undeniable, and Maya noticed it in the smallest details, the way conversations paused when she passed, the way eyes followed her for a second longer than necessary, the way even the usual impatience from guests had softened into something closer to uncertainty, and yet she did not change her rhythm. She continued moving through tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, each action precise and practiced, as if anchoring herself back into the role she had always known, but the room no longer fully allowed that illusion to hold. And at table 5, a young man who had earlier ignored her presence now spoke again, not with arrogance, but with hesitation. "You were incredible earlier," he said, almost unsure if he had the right to say it. And Maya paused just long enough to acknowledge him with a simple nod before continuing, because she understood something important. That recognition was not something she needed to chase. And at the entrance, the manager stood again, watching the flow of the evening settle, but his expression was no longer purely managerial. It was reflective, as if replaying every moment from earlier and realizing how differently it might have gone if no one had stepped forward. And somewhere in the back of the room, a television mounted high on the wall quietly played muted news footage, showing brief flashes of the earlier incident being reported outside the building. Though no sound carried into the dining area, only images that hinted at what had happened, and a few guests glanced at it briefly before looking away, not ready to fully engage with the reality of it yet. And Maya caught the reflection of it only once as she passed, not stopping, not reacting, but aware that stories like this rarely stayed contained for long. And as she returned to the service station, she placed the tray down carefully, her hands steady but her mind quieter now, not from exhaustion alone, but from the settling weight of everything that had unfolded. And for the first time since the beginning of her shift, she allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, just a breath, just enough to reset. And in that stillness, she did not think about recognition or consequence or what anyone else would say about what had happened. She only thought about the simple fact that someone had needed help, and she had responded. And in a world where hesitation often filled the space between people, that alone felt like its own kind of truth. And as she lifted the tray again and stepped back into the flow of the dining room, the evening continued around her, but it no longer defined her in the same way, because something had already shifted beneath the surface of everything that looked normal. And even if no one spoke it aloud, everyone there understood it now, that the night had not been about who was important, but about who chose to act when importance no longer mattered. The night had already begun to settle into its final rhythm, the kind that usually signals closure in a place built on precision and routine. But inside the dining room, nothing felt fully closed anymore, because even as the staff moved with practiced efficiency, resetting tables and preparing for the last wave of guests, there was an unspoken awareness that the memory of earlier events still lingered in every corner. And Maya could feel it without needing to look for it. The way conversations softened when she passed, the way some guests hesitated before asking for anything, as if unsure whether their usual expectations still applied in the same way. And she continued working through it all with steady discipline, her movements unchanged, her expression calm. But internally, there was a quiet awareness that something irreversible had taken root in the atmosphere of the room. And at the far end of the dining area, two executives who had arrived late were quietly discussing what had happened earlier, their voices lowered but not entirely hidden. "They are saying he is stable now," one of them said, glancing briefly toward the entrance, and the other nodded. "I heard it was that waitress who handled everything before the paramedics arrived." And the word waitress carried a different weight now than it had hours earlier, no longer dismissive, more uncertain, almost reluctant, and Maya, passing within earshot, did not react, but she noticed how quickly conversations shifted. When she came near, as if her presence now required recalibration from others, and near the bar, the manager stood reviewing the closing checklist, but his focus kept drifting, not toward numbers or timing, but toward the space where everything had unfolded earlier. And when he finally spoke, it was not to give instruction but to ask, almost to himself, did she really do all of that alone? And no one answered immediately, because the answer was already visible in the way the staff moved around her, not avoiding her, not challenging her, simply acknowledging her presence in a way that had not existed before. And as Maya wiped down the counter near the service station, she caught her reflection briefly in the polished surface, not stopping, just observing. And what she saw was not different, but what surrounded it was, because perception had shifted even if identity had not. And in that subtle gap between who she had always been and how she was now being seen, there was a quiet tension that no one in the room knew how to resolve. And then, as the final tables were cleared and the last guests began to leave, a woman at the entrance paused beside Maya, her expression hesitant, almost careful, and she said softly, "Thank you for earlier. Not performative, not exaggerated, just sincere." And Maya met her gaze briefly and replied with a simple nod. No elaboration, no acceptance of praise, just acknowledgement before moving on, because for her, the moment had already passed into action and consequence, not recognition. And as the doors finally opened for the last time that night and cool air from outside drifted into the warm interior, the restaurant began to empty in layers, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the one at the beginning of the evening. Not empty, but full of something unspoken, something that everyone who had been present would carry with them in a way they could not easily explain. And Maya stood near the service station one final time, scanning the room out of habit, confirming closure, and as she did, she understood that nothing about the night would be remembered in simple terms, because what had happened was not just an event, but a shift in how people saw what was possible. And even though the world outside continued as if unchanged, inside this space, something had already been rewritten. The night outside the restaurant felt colder than it should have, not because of the temperature, but because of the silence that followed something too significant to remain contained within a single place. And as Maya stepped out through the back service exit with her bag resting lightly on her shoulder, the city air greeted her differently than it had when she arrived earlier, almost as if it had also absorbed the weight of what had happened inside. And she paused for only a moment on the sidewalk, watching cars pass under the soft glow of streetlights, each one carrying lives unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place behind them. And her phone vibrated once in her pocket, then again, but she did not look at it immediately, because she already knew without checking that something had begun to spread beyond the walls of the restaurant, something faster than conversation and more permanent than rumor. And when she finally unlocked the screen, there were several messages from unknown numbers, some asking if she was the same person from the restaurant, others simply sending short words like "respect" or "you were there," and she closed the screen again without responding, continuing to walk toward the nearby bus stop where she usually ended her shifts. But tonight the distance felt different, not longer, just heavier. With awareness, and across the city in a private hospital wing, Ethan Cole lay under soft lighting and quiet monitoring equipment, his breathing now stable, his eyes partially open as doctors moved in controlled coordination around him, speaking in calm, measured tones about recovery. And though he was not fully conscious of everything yet, fragments of memory were beginning to surface, the feeling of falling, the sound of voices, the strange clarity of someone beside him who did not hesitate. And when he turned his head slightly, one of the nurses noticed the shift in his expression and leaned in, asking if he recognized where he was. But Ethan did not answer immediately, because his attention was still caught between fragments of the past hour and the unfamiliar absence of control. And back at the restaurant, the final lights were switched off one by one, leaving only reflections in darkened glass and the faint scent of an evening that had carried too much meaning to disappear. Quickly, and the staff gathered briefly near the entrance, speaking in low tones, not about tasks anymore, but about what they had witnessed, and even those who had been quiet earlier now found themselves replaying the moment when everything changed, not as a dramatic event, but as something that disrupted their understanding of who usually acted and who usually waited. And Maya, now on the bus heading home, sat near the window as the city moved past her in blurred lines of light and shadow, her posture still steady, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts no longer fully anchored in routine, because she understood that what had happened would not remain contained to a single night. It would move outward in ways she could not control, shaped by perception, memory, and the stories others would tell about it. And yet within her there was no expectation, no anticipation of recognition, only a quiet awareness that she had responded when it mattered. And as the bus continued forward through the sleeping streets, the world outside seemed unchanged, but within it, small shifts had already begun to form, subtle and irreversible, carried not by announcements or headlines yet, but by the people who had been there, and the ones who would soon hear about it. And somewhere in that unfolding distance between what was seen and what was understood, the night continued to expand beyond its original boundaries, no longer belonging to a single room, but to everyone who would eventually know it had happened. The city had not changed overnight, but the way Maya experienced it had, as if something subtle had shifted the distance between people and the spaces they moved through. And as she walked through the early morning streets toward her small apartment, the air felt lighter yet more exposed, like everything she passed now carried an echo of what had happened the night before, and she kept her pace steady, not rushing, not slowing, because routine was still the only thing that kept the world from feeling unstable. But even routine now felt slightly different, as if it was being observed from a new angle. And when she reached her building and climbed the familiar stairs, the sound of each step seemed louder than usual in the quiet hallway, and she paused briefly at her door, not because she was uncertain, but because her phone had begun to vibrate continuously, a pattern that suggested more than coincidence. And when she finally opened it, the notifications had multiplied, messages from unknown numbers, missed calls, and short phrases that repeated the same idea in different forms, people asking if she was the one who had helped the man at the restaurant, people saying they had seen footage, people saying they could not stop thinking about it. And Maya read none of them in full, only scanning enough to understand the direction of what was forming beyond her control. And she placed the phone down on the small kitchen counter before pouring herself a glass of water, standing still for a moment in the quiet of her apartment, where nothing had changed, where everything remained as it always had. And yet she felt a distance growing between this space and the version of herself that had existed just hours earlier, because in that short time, she had moved through a situation that others were now beginning to define for her, and across the city, in a hospital room washed in soft early light, Ethan Cole finally opened his eyes fully for the first time since the incident, blinking slowly as he adjusted to the sterile brightness around him. And when a doctor asked him simple questions, his responses were delayed but coherent, confirming stability, confirming recovery, and yet his attention drifted between words, as if something else was occupying the space where clarity should have been. And when he was left alone for a brief moment, he turned his head slightly toward the window, not seeing much, but thinking in fragments, remembering pressure, movement, and a presence that had not left him even as everything else faded. And he could not yet place it fully, but he knew it was real. And back in the city, the first wave of online discussion had already begun to spread, not as formal news, but as short clips and descriptions shared between strangers, each version slightly different, each one focusing on a different detail, but all circling the same core moment, the collapse, the hesitation, the one person who stepped forward when others did not. And Maya, unaware of the full scale of what was forming, continued her morning as usual, preparing for another shift, her movements calm, deliberate, almost unchanged, But inside her there was a quiet awareness that the boundary between private action and public perception had already been crossed, and what remained now was no longer in her control. Because once a moment like that entered the wider world, it stopped belonging to the person who lived it and started belonging to everyone who interpreted it. And as she looked out the small apartment window before leaving, the city outside appeared. The same as it always had, but the meaning attached to it was no longer identical, because somewhere beyond what she could see, a story had already begun to move without asking for permission, carrying her name in ways she had not yet heard, and continuing forward with a momentum that no single person could quietly contain. By the time Maya stepped into the afternoon shift, the world around her no longer felt like the same quiet system she had left the night before, because subtle changes had already begun to accumulate in ways she could not immediately see, though she could feel them in the behavior of others, in the way the staff at the restaurant paused a fraction longer when she entered through the service door, in the way conversations softened and eyes briefly followed her before pretending not to, and she did not acknowledge it outwardly. But she registered every shift with quiet awareness as she tied her apron and prepared for another routine evening. Even though routine now felt like a word trying to hold back something larger, and inside the break room, a television mounted in the corner finally caught her attention when a muted segment showed a familiar exterior, the restaurant, the entrance, blurred footage of movement from the night before, and she stopped for only a second, her expression unchanged, before turning away to continue preparing her station. But behind her, two coworkers leaned closer to the screen, whispering about what they were seeing, about how quickly the clip had spread, about how many people were replaying the moment when everything had shifted. And across the city in a private hospital suite, Ethan Cole sat upright now, still recovering, still surrounded by quiet medical monitoring, but no longer disconnected from awareness. Because fragments of the night had begun to return in sharper detail, not fully formed memories yet, but impressions that carried emotional weight, the feeling of losing control, the absence of panic from others, and the presence of someone who had moved toward him when no one else did. And when a staff member mentioned that media outlets were beginning to ask questions about the incident, Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond the room, as if trying to reconstruct something he could not yet fully articulate. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but distant, asking only for clarity about who had intervened before emergency responders arrived. And meanwhile, on social platforms across the country, short clips and descriptions were circulating rapidly, not polished news coverage, but fragmented perspectives from people who had been present, each version emphasizing different details, the hesitation of the crowd, the moment of collapse, the one individual who stepped forward without waiting, and Maya's name, though not yet fully understood by the public, was beginning to appear repeatedly in comment sections and reposted captions, and by late afternoon, even within the restaurant, the management had begun receiving inquiries from corporate offices asking for confirmation of events, asking for identification of staff involved, asking for statements that had not yet been prepared, and Maya, still unaware of the full scale of attention forming around her, continued her work without deviation, refilling stations, checking tables, maintaining the rhythm of service as if the world outside had not shifted, but those around her could not fully return to the same rhythm anymore, because something had already disrupted their sense of normality. And even the simplest interactions now carried an unspoken awareness that what had once gone unnoticed had become visible. And as the evening approached again and the lights inside the restaurant began to warm the space for a new cycle of guests, there was a quiet tension beneath the surface of everything, not disruptive, not loud, but persistent, like a story continuing to write itself beyond the control of the people who had lived its first chapter. By the time evening returned to the city, it no longer felt like a continuation of the day before, but rather like the beginning of something that had already been set in motion and could not be reversed. And inside the restaurant, the lighting had been adjusted again to its familiar warm tone. Tables were reset with careful precision, and guests began to arrive in small waves, unaware at first glance that anything had changed. Yet Maya could feel it immediately in the way people looked at the space, in the way some paused slightly longer at the entrance, in the way conversations lowered when her name was spoken even casually by staff, and she continued her work with the same steady discipline as always, moving between tables, checking details, maintaining flow, but the atmosphere around her had shifted into something quieter and more observant, as if the room itself had learned to pay attention differently. And at table 3, a couple who had been present the night before exchanged a brief glance when she approached, not speaking directly about what they remembered, but acknowledging it through silence. And Maya responded as she always did, professionally, evenly, without pause, because for her the work had not changed even if perception had. And yet she could not ignore the subtle accumulation of awareness forming around her, because it was not isolated anymore. It was spreading. And somewhere in that same city, Ethan Cole sat in a private office at the hospital, reviewing a tablet where curated news briefings were beginning to compile fragmented coverage of the incident, each headline carefully worded but unmistakably referencing the moment he had collapsed, and more importantly, the unknown staff member who had acted before medical teams arrived. And though his expression remained controlled, there was a stillness in him that suggested deeper processing, as if the details were assembling themselves into something personal rather than professional. And when a physician briefly entered to check his condition, Ethan asked again, more precisely this time, for any available information about the person who had assisted him, not as a casual question, but as something closer to necessity, and the answer, though limited, confirmed that her identity had been recorded through multiple eyewitness accounts. And back at the restaurant, the evening service continued to build, but the rhythm had permanently altered, because guests were now more aware of their surroundings, more attentive to staff interactions, and even the smallest gestures carried a sense of observation that had not existed before. And Maya moved through it without hesitation, refilling glasses, responding to requests, maintaining composure. But the space between actions and perception had narrowed, and she could feel that narrowing in every interaction, not as pressure, but as recognition that could not be undone. And by the time the second wave of guests settled in, conversations at several tables began to reference what they had seen online, short clips circulating quietly on phones, replayed in low brightness beneath menus and wine lists. And although no one spoke loudly about it, the awareness was collective, because the story had already moved beyond the walls of the restaurant and into something larger, something that connected strangers through a shared moment of witnessed decision. And Maya, passing near the entrance once more, caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass doors, unchanged in appearance but surrounded now by meaning she had not sought. And she continued forward without stopping, because for her the night was still a sequence of responsibilities rather than a narrative, even as the world around her continued to reshape itself around what she had done. And what remained unspoken but understood was that the memory of that single moment had already begun to outlive the moment itself. The following morning did not arrive with silence, because silence was no longer something the city could maintain around what had already begun to circulate. And as Maya stepped out of her apartment into the early light, she immediately noticed that something had changed in the way the world responded to her presence. Not dramatically, not with interruption, but with subtle awareness that lingered in glances and pauses that had not existed before. And when she reached the restaurant later that day, she was greeted by a different kind of atmosphere, one that felt heavier with recognition rather than routine, as if the space itself had absorbed the weight of everything that had been shared online overnight, because the footage had spread far beyond what anyone inside the building had expected, reaching news summaries, social platforms, and private conversations that repeated the same fragments of the same moment, the collapse, the hesitation, and the one individual who acted when others did not. And Maya moved through it as she always had, steady, composed, performing each task with the same precision. But now every movement carried an awareness from those around her that could not be ignored. And even the simplest exchanges with guests were accompanied by brief moments of recognition that were never fully spoken aloud. And across the city in a quiet office at the hospital, Ethan Cole sat fully upright now, reviewing a printed briefing that summarized the growing public attention around the incident, his expression controlled but reflective, because what he was reading was no longer just about his own condition, but about how the moment he had experienced was being remembered by others. And in every version of that memory, one detail remained consistent: the presence of the waitress who had stepped forward without hesitation, And when a member of his executive team entered to discuss public response strategy, Ethan raised a simple question that redirected the entire conversation, not about damage control or corporate implications, but about identifying her. Because for him, the detail that refused to fade was not the collapse itself, but the steadiness of the person who had been beside him when everything else fell away. And by the evening, the restaurant had begun to receive formal inquiries from media outlets and corporate representatives requesting confirmation of staff involvement. But Maya remained focused on her responsibilities, not engaging with speculation, not altering her routine, because for her the event had already been completed in action and did not require reinterpretation. And yet the world around her continued to reinterpret it anyway, reshaping it into narratives she had not created. And as she finished her final shift of the week and stepped outside into the cool air once more, she paused briefly at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the city move forward in its usual rhythm, unaware of how much had shifted within it. And her phone remained quiet now, as if the initial wave of attention had settled into something more sustained and less chaotic, something that would continue without needing her participation. And in that moment, she understood without needing confirmation that the story had already left her completely, no longer belonging to the room where it began, no longer belonging even to the night itself, but to everyone who had seen it, shared it, or simply understood what it meant. And as she began walking home again, the world around her looked familiar in structure but different in meaning, because once a single moment changes how people see what is possible, it does not remain confined to memory. It becomes part of everything that follows.